On November 6th, Los Angeles will become the first city in the country to vote on a measure in favor of a public bank, one owned and regulated by the city rather than by Wall Street, Measure B. The campaign is led by Public Bank LA, a grassroots movement of young progressive activists. I attended their rally at City Hall, where over 100 people gathered to support the measure, which was attended by celebrities like comedian Eric Andre.
Whose streets? Our streets! Whose bank? Ours bank! I've never done a chant before. I suck at it.
Now, the city of Los Angeles currently has anywhere between $8 and $12 billion of public money, that's tax dollars and fees, in the banks. How much of that money do you think the banks can just loan out willy-nilly to the riskiest investments they can think of? The answer should be none. What are you talking about? What if they blow all the money on horrible mortgages using a racist system that targets our society's most vulnerable? But the actual answer is 90%.
We can create a public bank too. LA is one of the biggest economies in the world, but we, the workers, are who make this city rich. The wealth created here in Los Angeles is through your labor and hard work. 50% of all wealth we create in Los Angeles, we lose to the clutches of Wall Street bankers.
Money, billions of dollars that Wall Street banks utilizes to finance wars and private prisons and immigration detention centers. We need to keep that money here locally. We need to be able to cut Wall Street out as a middleman, to be able to recirculate that money back into our local economy to fund and finance the things we need. Affordable housing, green energy, infrastructure projects. On November 6th, LA City voters will be the first in the country to voice their support for a public bank.
This ballot measure is the first step in several steps of getting a public bank for our city, which will cut out the Wall Street middleman and save our city a lot of money, doubling the purchasing power of our tax dollars.
To learn more about public banks, I sat down with Ellen Brown, an author of several books on Wall Street and chair of the Public Banking Institute. One of the arguments that you have for why public banks are more beneficial is that they perform better than private banks. They make more profits, they're immune to the kind of crises that private banks go through from speculative schemes and things like that. But that means the bank's making a profit. So where is the profits going in a public bank?
Well, that's a critical feature of a public bank, that with private banks, you send your money off to Wall Street, but they have absolutely no obligation to reinvest that money into your local community. But a public bank, we have one, which is the Bank of North Dakota, has a mandate to serve the local community. So they do reinvest that money back into the community so you get lower cost loans, or any excess profits go back to the state to spend on all those things that the people need.
And who's making the decisions about what happens with the surplus and the profits? Is there an elected body? Is it the local government? Is there a CEO of the bank?
So for the money that goes back to the legislature, to the general fund, that's just general money that the legislature decides what to do with. It's just, in North Dakota, they actually have lowered taxes because they had extra money. So that's what can happen. So it can serve the public in that way. The question of who gets the loans, like what sectors you particularly focus on, that would be in your charter. And the way we're, of course, working on numerous models, but in Los Angeles, what they're hoping to do is to put in the charter that there are specific things that will be focused on, and that they will invest in low-cost housing, that type of thing, things that people need, and they won't invest in certain things that that people generally don't approve of.
Right, and we're talking about a lot of money. So like in Los Angeles alone, you say that 50% of infrastructure projects, like rebuilding roads, building new housing and things like that, 50% is just going to the banks in interest and fees and things like that. And so how much money is wasted having a private banking system for the city, and what does that mean for the potential of what we could do with a public bank?
In Los Angeles last year, the city paid $170 million just in fees. And in 2014, it was close to $300 million. Wow. So we pay a lot of money.
Okay, so one of the arguments for establishing a public bank in Los Angeles is that we can use that public bank to divest from the fossil fuel industry. And so it has this angle of benefiting the environment and preventing catastrophic climate change. But the bank in North Dakota, which is often used as an example of how successful public banks are, it's essentially a subsidiary of the fossil fuel industry and is very successful because of the amount of oil wealth that goes through it. And so how will the LA bank public bank be different in terms of its relation to the fossil fuel industry and even the defense industry?
I don't know that the Bank of North Dakota actually subsidizes the fossil fuel industry. It is in North Dakota, and it was responsible for much of the productivity of North Dakota after 2008. But the whole oil business collapsed in 2014, and still the Bank of North Dakota, for 14 years, it just reported record profits after record profits. So it is not dependent on oil. Anyway, in Los Angeles, it was protests against Wells Fargo that actually motivated this. We had this very active group of young people that are, so they were down there in City Hall campaigning to divest from Wells Fargo. But then the question is, where do you put the money? The options are going to be another Wall Street bank unless we set up our own, because the local banks are too small, and all the Wall Street banks are guilty of a litany of frauds. So.
It was out of the successful fight to get LA City Council to divest from Wells Fargo that led to the creation of Public Bank LA, which they see as an extension of the same movement.
Early last year, we launched Divest LA and pushed the city of Los Angeles to divest from Wells Fargo and create greater social accountability for our city's banking practices. Out of that came Public Bank LA, and that's a fight we've been fighting for the last year, to divest our city's finances out of Wall Street.
At Standing Rock, really the fight got elevated to consciousness, where we realized that we have to actually divest our funds from the banks that are funding fossil fuel extraction, that are funding private prisons, that are funding weapons manufacture, and all of these things that are hurting our world.
I always thought, I want my taxes to go where I want them to go. I want them to work with the homeless. I don't want them to fuel pipelines and all these things, right?
A lot of people think, oh, well, Bank of America has a rainbow logo on it, so they're LGBTQ plus friendly. However, my question is, as an organizer, is institutions like that, take money, fund into private prison contracts that help incarcerate our queer people of color in jail. So I'm more interested in ways of how to divest, I guess, from big banking institutions that appropriate our struggles and their logos, but their money goes against our communities.
So why do we need a ballot measure to have a public bank? What's to prevent a city from just starting a public bank on its own? Why does it need to be fought in the electoral arena right now?
Yeah, well, most cities you wouldn't need a ballot measure, but we happen to have a special charter provision in our city charter that was passed in 1913 that said that the city will have all the benefits of a municipal corporation, except that if it wants to engage in a commercial or a fully commercial or industrial enterprise, that it needs to get voter approval. So our city council decided, well, we'll start there and we'll get rid of that requirement.
That's right. So the first step of the struggle is getting the ballot measure passed so there can be a public bank option, but then it's going to have to continue with making sure that those who are running it are held accountable and that they're pursuing the investment and things like that in a way that meets the demands of all the people that support this option.
Yeah, so ideally you would have a committee that would determine those things.
The measure has a range of support from both establishment politicians and grassroots community organizations. Yes on B has been endorsed by anti-war groups, environmental organizations, and several unions, including the United Teachers of Los Angeles and the American Postal Workers Union. While initially ignored by the big banks, Bloomberg Businessweek and the LA Times have recently published scathing critiques.
In the latest Bloomberg article, the California Bankers Association came out and said, quotes, Measure B is potentially destructive to commercial banks. And they're now raising funds to lobby against us. And this is a grassroots people-powered movement with no money. The American Bankers Association just put out an op-ed piece in The Hill full of disinformation.
You know, what do voters need to know about this? Because we know now that there's kind of a counter campaign being mounted. The LA Times ran that little hit piece, most half-baked idea to ever hit City Hall.
Can I actually speak on that?
Oh, please do.
Okay, so here's the problem with the LA Times hit piece. It's too obvious, right? So that was done by their editorial board, and the president of their editorial board used to work for multiple firms that helped elect Michael Bloomberg and worked for Wall Street, like several of the banks that this would disempower.
Yeah, and their whole argument was this idea that we can't let banking be run by politics. Banking has to be run by economics. You know, what does a statement like that mean to you in this campaign?
Sure, a statement like that to me means that they want only 6 white dudes to take all the money and everyone else to die. Essentially, what they're saying, right, is like, oh, you trust politicians to run your bank? Do you trust bankers to run the banks? You know what I mean? Like, first and foremost, this isn't going to be like a piggy bank for City Hall. You know, this isn't going to be like the mayor's little rainy day fund. This is a brand new institution that's going to have not only citizen representation, but demographic representation.
The only challenge to the campaign seems to be a lack of awareness, as this dedicated, all-volunteer staff is fighting to make voters aware of what the measure is. And organizers aren't just working for a local victory, but to set a precedent as part of a larger nationwide initiative.
So across the country, we have over a dozen public banking movements building in cities and states across the country, 15 pieces of legislation. This is going to be the first time in American history for a voter mandate on public banking, and that's why this vote in Los Angeles on November 6th is such a hugely determinative vote for the entire public banking movement.
Okay, so this is not just about Los Angeles. You say that this has nationwide implications. What would it mean if a public bank was established here in Los Angeles for the rest of the country?
The broader implications for me, it seems to me, is that right now we're totally dependent on Wall Street. We've been dependent on Wall Street for 200 years, and we can't seem to break free. We've tried to regulate, and they always come out on top. Why? Because they actually create our money supply. Banks create money when they make loans. And if we want to get that power back, and if we want to avoid the next crisis, which many people say is coming, we need to have our own banks. So we need a precedent, and if LA can do it, that would be great.
So while there's a lot of enthusiasm here, there's been no polling done to gauge the popularity of the measure, so it's too soon to tell if it's actually resonating with voters. Now, the big banks have yet to launch any kind of counter-campaign against the initiative, but that may change after today, as this movement is not one in isolation, but part of a nationwide trend, where grassroots activists to the left of the Democratic Party are waging formidable election campaigns at a local level, and with some surprise victories. So the next few weeks will show if Los Angeles will be the next to chalk up another win against the establishment. This is Mike Prysner reporting for the Real News Network in Los Angeles.